Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to talk about a really unfortunate thing that occurred it's been in the past week, 2 weeks. We've been talking about it for well over a month when it was just in the stages of being a rumor. But this past week, it has been proven true. Showtime Sports is going out of business at the end of the year. John, what do you make of this for starters?
First, I'm shocked that Rick Glazer got something right. One of his rumors, he nailed one for once. So I guess hats off to him. But his batting record has not been spectacular. Let's put the least. He's not batting, very high, and he's not going to win the AL batting title or anything like that anytime soon. So, no, I mean, it's something of a sad day because Showtime has been a main player in boxing. It's kind of a home for boxing the last 38 years. It's behind HBO. Is probably the premier home for boxing in the U.S. But since HBO left a few years ago, it's been the premier spot. So it's and they've been having a stellar year for big fights and big pay-per-views.
So why is it that they've gone out of business with all of those things that you said? They don't have the competition from HBO. They have been having a banner year. They have a small staff, just 38 people that are going to lose their jobs.
Well, they do have a lot of independent contractors, the people that show up to record the fights.
They're not going to lose their jobs. According to Dan Raphael, he spoke with people that say that the freelancers and contractors, your Luke Thomases, your Shaquille Majuris, and possibly your Esther Lynn's, they won't be affected by the cuts.
Well, that'll be surprised. I mean, they might just move on to wherever PBC goes eventually too. So, but I would say more the cameramen and stuff that record the boxing matches and stuff. But they'll probably get signed on to wherever PBC goes. The big reason is it has very little to do with the boxing side or even the MMA side. The big reason is Paramount's struggling. Paramount's billions of dollars in debt. Their stock has just bottomed out, and so the word went out that they are cutting costs. They're not just cutting costs, they're cutting anything where the return on investment is not tremendous. It's because they want, to put as little money into stuff and make as much money as possible. And Showtime Sports was not something that had a huge return on. I don't think they were losing money on it because they've had a successful year, but I guess some years they did lose money on it. It's an up and down business. It's not a consistent. There's the lump. They have not removed the lumpiness from their side compared to as the Endeavor says about the UFC, who removed their lumpiness. They still have lumpiness in boxing, but overall I'm sure it's a profitable venture. It's just not very profitable, and it's at times risky. So that's for them, that's not worth it. And they're gonna unload it.
What does this mean for the broadcasting of boxing in general? Because we had HBO leave us, 4 years back. Now we're going to have Showtime leave us. That basically leaves DAZN, ESPN, and over in Europe, Sky Sports, which we don't have access to. So what does that mean for the broadcasting of boxing?
Well, I'm just going to focus on North America, the U.S., because we're also the biggest market money-wise. So we play, outsized importance in the sport. I'm not 100% certain right now. I mean, it narrows the amount of locations it's playing in, but I don't think that's going to last long. From all accounts, PBC already sounds like they have a new broadcast partner. And rumors are it's going to be Amazon. The other possibility is DAZN, which would be somewhat surprising to me, but I could see him doing a short-term deal with DAZN, but they're going to go somewhere. Let's say Amazon. Well, we lose. The same thing kind of happened with HBO. HBO went out in 2018, 5 years ago. HBO had their last I believe it was 2018, had their last broadcast. DAZN showed up. You had ESPN. You had Fox was at the time involved, and same with Showtime. So boxing is in a weird way, I guess you could say, okay, it's not so strong that Showtime decided that they were going to keep it, not Showtime, but Paramount. But at the same time, there's going to be a home for this. You have these massive events with Canelo, Tank Davis, Crawford, all of them are still under contract with the PBC. They're going to find someone that wants to get involved in the sport. And in many ways, I mean, people think that this, the money's drying up, but we saw this again before when HBO left and everybody thought, the fighters are going to have to start asking for less. The money's going to dry up. Well, the very next year or two, we saw more money in boxing than ever before as DAZN started just throwing money and ESPN did and everybody else. So it's very possible if Amazon comes in that they open the checkbook compared to other channels and they throw a bunch of money on to get top fights on their platform.
How much of Paramount's money troubles and the need to unload as much as they can boils down to the pandemic?
I don't know if it's that much the pandemic because, pandemic actually helped a lot of channels, streaming services, got a lot of subscribers. I think their big thing is they did two dumb things is they remerged CBS and Viacom into Paramount Global. And so they thought they're going to do efficiency, but it basically financialization, it made instead of making one stronger company, it made a bigger, weaker company. They also jumped into streaming and stuff, and the cord cutting really hurt them. They just were not prepared for that. And plus, the pivoting to streaming has been a disaster for most networks. Even Disney, that's been Disney's been this giant company, and they are now struggling with their streaming services with ESPN and Disney Plus. The amount of money lost, and so they're going to probably a lot of people think they're going to unload ESPN. So it's these geniuses that make vast fortunes at the head of studios. They're not so smart that they didn't see that this was going to backfire on them to go all in on streaming, and yet they still did. So I would say it has less to do with the pandemic and much more to do with just poor decisions by the executives.
What does this mean for Bellator?
Well, Bellator already sounds like they're gone. The word has been that they're going to be acquired by PFL, but who knows? Maybe PFL is not going to acquire them. Maybe let's say PFL doesn't acquire them. I guess the next step is you'd think Paramount would want to sell them to get some return, but maybe there's more money to make by writing them off and just taking a big tax write-off. We saw that with Warner Brothers with certain movies, which they just basically deleted and then wrote off as losses. Maybe there's a bigger benefit to Paramount for just writing Bellator off and letting it just die, which would be, I guess, good for the fighters in the sense they'd be free agents suddenly, but it'd be bad for them in the same sense that there's not a promotion paying their checks. But right now, the word is, my guess is that they're already sold. They're just finishing up the paperwork, and PFL is going to acquire them. For how much is the question. The majority of it apparently is going to be in shares of PFL. I don't know how valuable that is, but that's the majority going to be in. And then they'll have ownership of Bellator, and I am not sure I guess they're going to keep them as a separate brand for a while was the word, but we'll have to wait and see. It's everything's still kind of up in the air.
Okay, let's say that PFL doesn't buy them and they go under. What would the market look like for fighters if that happened?
Oh, the market is it's going to be terrible. Remember when Strikeforce got bought up and suddenly the free agent market for fighters was just there was Bellator out there, but they weren't throwing much money around. And the fighters just started re-signing with the UFC, didn't want to test the market anymore, even risk it no matter what. Well, at the time it was hard too, because Joe Silva would freeze your contract forever if he tried to. Mm-hmm. But everybody noticed that there was a contraction in the market, and it's going to be much worse this time because you got Bellator by far, they're not paying like, Francis Ngannou is making the most out of anybody outside the UFC. They're not paying anybody that type of money, but they're paying by far their top fighters, the top 10 or 15 per weight class in their promotion by far more than any other promotion. They're paying numerous guys, like, close to $500,000 a fight, maybe more, up to $1 million for some of them. Some of the top guys, a lot of their top guys make more than the equivalent person in the UFC. Only the top pay-per-view type attractions make more than a lot of the top Bellator guys. So right then, that's a huge group of fighters that are making more. Are they going to get that anywhere else? there's not going to be Bellator anymore. One championship doesn't really seem like they're in the business of MMA much anymore, do they? I mean, they're not. They put on very, very few MMA fights. There's no big signings been announced by them. No one from the UFC has walked over there in a while for noteworthy contracts. So they seem to have been kind of exited the business. So they're not really offering an option for fighters. So it'd be just the PFL. And the PFL, there's still their business model is those tournaments, which pays out the winner. They might sign a few fighters for the UFC, but I think, they're not having a lot of revenue coming either. So I don't know if they're going to pick up. I doubt they'll pick up the slack of a Bellator. In fact, too, the other thing too to consider is if you leave the UFC, it was nice that there was a PFL and Bellator both potentially bidding for you to drive up your pay. Now, if you leave the UFC and the UFC doesn't want to offer you anything, well, the one other promotion that's going to be left over, PFL, doesn't have to offer too much because there's no one else going to be competing with them.
Ugh, my gosh. And what is it going to mean for boxers?
Well, I mean, it's going to be short term, probably sad, and that there's not going to be a company that has the promotional weight and the know-how. But longer term, it probably not much. I mean, HBO leaving the market, it sucked in the sense that HBO was a long time major player, and they knew the business, they knew the sport. People were aware of where to go to watch the fights. But the business has just continued. The sport of boxing has just continued. We've had a lot of big pay-per-views, a lot of big events without HBO's involvement. I got a feeling the same is going to happen, is that Amazon's going to pick them up or someone's going to pick up the PBC roster, and they're going to continue. The sports just continue along. I mean, one positive thing is what Oscar De La Hoya was saying recently about how the promoters got to work together. And which is, it's always kind of self-serving when one of the promoters say that, because he has the weakest roster and he needs to make fights and he needs a lot of help. But at the same time, I think there is a realization the promotions have been working together to put on big pay-per-view fights. They've been letting their fighters cross the aisle to put on pay-per-views. I think we do need to see more of that as well for the streaming services, because that's their bread and butter to keep the doors open, those streaming payments. And they're not putting on as big of fights on the streaming platforms. So they can't get as much money from those streaming platforms. So the next step is not just making a bunch of pay-per-views. It's doing some sort of a lot more cross promotion to build up big fights that can be on ESPN or DAZN, or, and honestly, long term, I'm not sure how long DAZN's going to be around, but for Amazon, if they're going to be PBC, I mean, in a weird way, I would not be shocked if PBC signed on with DAZN for a short term, right, until Top Rank's exclusive ESPN deal's over, and then go to ESPN. And the only reason I think that is because you look at the experience ESPN has had with UFC, the pay-per-views have actually sold a lot overall in totality for ESPN. What makes it a difficult deal for ESPN is they have to pay out a guaranteed amount per pay-per-view. That deal would be a goldmine for them if they only had to pay a split every time there was a pay-per-view event. Well, they could probably negotiate that with a boxing promotion or entity of some sort, that we will do something similar with the UFC. We'll put on a number of pay-per-views per year on ESPN Plus, but we will pay you a split and a much lower guarantee, so it's not nearly the risk we have with the UFC.
Let me ask you this. We have watched promotions come and go. Do you find any similarities in, say, like when Elite XC went down or when Strikeforce went down? Is there a tie in there some way, or am I just looking at this all wrong?
Well, actually, it's interesting that Showtime has been this long-term home actually for MMA. They were the first, not the first, I should say, but they put on some of the first UFC competition rivals. I mean, none of them were real in the UFC class, but they put on one of the first major non-UFC promotions. IFL beat them, but then came Elite XC on Showtime, right? So they gave a platform to one of the bigger secondary promotions, the guys fighting to be second behind the UFC. So they gave Elite XC a platform. Now Elite XC disappeared because they just spent a ton of money like drunken sailors, because they had a bunch of capital raised and they had to spend it, and they didn't know where to spend it.
And they had Jeremy Lappin in there, the reverse Midas.
it was, I mean, it was just a terrible, they were $87 million spent in the hole, not in the hole, but they blew through $87 million of capital raised, which is just insane, buying up promotions for no reason.
Right,
the money could have been
Spirit, and they bought Rumble on the Rock or something.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of interesting promotions they bought up, but what benefit were they? Were they running a ton of events in Korea? No. Did it bring in revenue? No. It's just they had the money. They wanted to acquire fighters. Their business model was completely ass backwards. It just made no sense. So they've collapsed after the Kimbo Slice loss, and then Strikeforce came in. Strikeforce then was probably the last hurrah of a promotion that had, even though they were second to the UFC, could actually make a dent in the landscape. And you look at Strikeforce compared to Elite and Bellator, the big difference between them, I guess, especially between Strikeforce and Bellator now, is Strikeforce was competing at a time when the UFC was running a lot less events and none of their prelims were on the air. They all were dark, right? And so there was space to have another promotion. On top of that, Strikeforce had a lot more talent, even more than we talk about Bellator's talent now. Strikeforce at the time, comparable to UFC, had a much higher percentage of like top 10 fighters, top 25 fighters from the consensus ranks. I think Bellator has like 8% or something of the top 10 fighters of the main men's divisions, where Strikeforce at the time had 14 or 15%. So it's a sizable difference in the amount of top 10 fighters. And they dwarf all the other promotions too now. So they had a lot more quality, relevant fights. They had a lot more space. So they became they could put on big time events. And the only reason they disappeared is people want to talk about Strikeforce ran themselves and go, no, it's because the UFC made an offer to the partners of Scott Coker, potentially with some threats in there that they would run them out of business. They didn't. It's in the antitrust lawsuit. And they decided to sell and cash out. And that's it. There's nothing about Strikeforce is not a business that like went bankrupt because they ran it in the ground. They just sold out because they decided it was better to take the money now, the short money, instead of competing with the UFC in the long term. Bellator in turn, they have not gotten the traction Strikeforce has. They don't, like I said, we don't have the fighters. The UFC now floods the airwaves. They have tons of events, just twice as much airtime probably as they did before. There's just no space for them. And without the fact that there's no real, they don't have any of the top, they don't have any fighter like Fedor Emelianenko where you could argue he is the number one heavyweight in the world. They never had that. They do not get the attention them. So them disappearing it's as much as they've built up a roster that's impressive compared to their promotion, it's almost them going out with a whimper because there's so little attention or interest in their product now. So all three of them are interesting that all three were, I guess, put in place as being major rivals to the UFC, but all three in reality were much different rivals than the others.
Sounds like Strikeforce had the best claim to being number two.
Oh, I think by far they were easily number two. You know, go back to Pride, who was arguably number one.
Oh, yes.
But Strikeforce was, I think, easily could be argued their number two. And they also had access to the Dream roster, who was loaded with a bunch of top 10 lightweights and even middleweights. So there was, they just had access to a much higher caliber of fighter at the time.
Didn't they do a little business back and forth with Cage Warriors too? And as well as King of the Cage? Didn't they do business frequently?
Not that I recall. I don't remember them doing business with them. I remember them working with Pride in the very early days when they sent Alistair Overeem over.
Yeah. And Valentine as well.
Yeah, but I don't know about they might have had deals with other promotions, but it was less. I don't think it was as strong as the Dream one was. There was, it was kind of like how Ryzen and Bellator has been lately. So,
yeah. Well, man, that about wraps us up in a nice, neat nutshell. In case you guys haven't noticed, this is one of our short shot freebie episodes. You can thank our fearless leader here who came up with the idea that we should give you guys some free content every once in a while. Hopefully, you will take that free content and tuck it away right next to where you're going to subscribe to the show. because that's the most important thing.
We're like drug dealers. We're giving you a little taste.
Exactly.
To get you addicted to the hardcore stuff is going to be behind the paywall, but the the freebie right now.
Yes, nothing on this episode will be behind a paywall, but the next one will have plenty of content behind the paywall. So make sure you subscribe. And if you already do that, just tell all your friends, your family, tell your foes. Tell them to subscribe, and you guys can argue over what we talk about.
Hate buy subscriptions for people.
Exactly. The haterist subscriber. That's what you want to be. Anyways, do me a favor. Follow this guy on Twitter. He is at HeyNotTheFace. He also has his DMs open. So if you have questions, comments, anything like that, would like to contribute to the mailbag, that is how you do it. You can also email him, and he is heynottheface@gmail.com. You can email me, crooklyn949@gmail.com, or you can DM me on Twitter. My DMs are also open with any questions or comments you may have for John. So, on that note, we're going to wrap things up. Until next time, y'all already know the drill. Please stay safe.
Not in the face! Thank you.